Human beings lie far more often than we realize. In fact, many psychologists believe that the average person hears small lies countless times throughout a single day without even noticing. These lies are not always dramatic or malicious. Many of them are simple excuses, exaggerations, or attempts to avoid embarrassment. A friend might lie about where they spent the evening. A coworker might hide the real reason a task was delayed, or a family member might pretend everything is fine when it isn't. This shows that lying is not limited to bad people. It is a common part of everyday social behavior. Because deception can appear in ordinary conversations, learning how to recognize the signs of a lie becomes extremely valuable. When you understand how people behave when they are not telling the truth, you become less likely to be misled by stories that sound convincing but are not real. One powerful way to detect a lie is by asking smarter questions. Most people ask simple yes or no questions, which makes lying extremely easy. For example, asking, "Did you go out last night?" gives the other person a quick opportunity to simply say no, even if it's not true. Instead, a more effective approach is what investigators sometimes call the magic question trick. This method involves asking a question that assumes the event already happened. For instance, instead of asking whether they went out, you might ask, "Why did you come home so late last night?" This forces the person to react immediately. If they were lying, they now have to quickly invent a detailed explanation instead of giving a simple answer. Creating a story on the spot requires mental effort, and that's where many liars begin to make mistakes, contradict themselves, or show signs of stress. Another powerful technique for spotting deception is known as the 5-second rule. When you ask someone a question, pay close attention to their reaction during the first 5 seconds. This short moment is important because the brain has not yet had enough time to fully construct a convincing lie. In those first seconds, a person's body often reveals signals that their words are trying to hide. Watch carefully for small behavioral changes. For example, they might suddenly touch their face, rub their nose, or cover their mouth. They may look away instead of maintaining eye contact, pause for an unusually long moment before answering, or their voice may change in tone or speed. One single signal does not necessarily mean someone is lying, because people naturally behave differently under pressure. However, when you notice 2 or more of these signs appearing together within those first few seconds, it may indicate that the person is struggling to hide the truth. Another effective method for detecting deception is establishing a behavioral baseline. A baseline simply means observing how a person normally behaves when they are relaxed and comfortable. Everyone has their own natural pattern show. They speak, how fast they talk, their posture, eye contact, and the way they move their hands while communicating. By paying attention to these normal behaviors during casual conversation, you create a mental reference point. Later, when you ask a more sensitive or important question, you can compare their current behavior with that baseline. If something suddenly changes, it may signal discomfort or deception. For example, someone who usually maintains steady eye contact might suddenly avoid looking at you. A person who normally speaks quickly and confidently may begin speaking slowly or hesitating. These shifts don't automatically prove a lie, but they are valuable clues. Detecting lies often depends on noticing these subtle changes in behavior. Another useful technique for detecting a lie is asking about the same situation in 2 different ways. Instead of relying on a single question, bring the topic up again later, but change how you ask it. The key idea is to create a small time gap between the 2 questions so the person doesn't immediately notice that you are checking their consistency. People who are telling the truth usually remember the real event, so their answers remain stable even when the question is phrased differently. Their story stays natural because they are simply recalling what actually happened. However, someone who is lying has to remember the story they invented earlier. Since the story is not based on real memory, it is much harder to keep every detail consistent. As a result, their answers may slowly change, contradict earlier statements, or include confusing details. These inconsistencies can become strong clues that the person may not be telling the truth. Another important signal to watch for when detecting deception is weak or uncertain language. People who are telling the truth usually speak with clear and confident statements because they are describing something that actually happened. In contrast, someone who is lying often feels unsure about what they are saying. Because of this uncertainty, they tend to use softer words that leave room for escape. You may hear phrases such as, maybe, I think, probably, or I guess. These expressions allow the person to avoid committing fully to the statement. For example, instead of confidently saying, "I was at home all evening," a liar might say, "I think I was probably at home." Notice how the sentence becomes weaker and less certain. This type of language acts like a safety net. If the lie is later challenged, they can claim they were never completely sure in the first place. Paying attention to these small linguistic clues can reveal hidden hesitation and possible dishonesty. Another common behavior of someone who may be lying is suddenly changing the topic when they feel pressure. When a person senses that you are getting close to the truth, their mind may enter a defensive mode. Instead of continuing the conversation, they try to escape from the uncomfortable situation. One of the easiest ways to do this is by quickly shifting the subject to something completely unrelated. For example, while you are asking about a specific event, they might suddenly say something like, "Oh, by the way, did you see that funny video earlier?" Or, "I almost forgot to tell you something important." This abrupt change is often a sign that they are trying to redirect your attention away from the original question. It acts like a psychological escape route. When this happens, a good strategy is to calmly bring the conversation back to the original topic and ask them to continue explaining. Their reaction at that moment can reveal a lot about whether they were telling the truth. Another effective strategy for detecting deception is known as the interrupt trick. When someone is telling a story, especially if the story might not be true, you can briefly interrupt them and ask a question about an earlier detail in the timeline. For example, if someone is explaining what they did at the store, you might suddenly ask, "What were you doing right before you decided to go to the store?" This simple interruption can reveal a lot. Telling the truth usually relies on real memories, so a truthful person can easily move back and forth in the timeline of events. However, someone who is lying must carefully manage the story they invented. When you interrupt the narrative and force them to think about another part of the story, their brain suddenly has to juggle multiple details at once. This mental pressure often causes confusion, hesitation, or contradictions, making the deception much easier to notice. Another clever technique for detecting deception is called the fake detail trap. This method works by intentionally adding a small, incorrect detail into the conversation and carefully observing how the other person reacts. For example, while discussing an event, you might casually say something like, "So that happened when it was raining, right?" Even if the person never mentioned rain before. Someone who is telling the truth will usually correct you immediately. Because they remember the real situation, they feel comfortable saying something like, "No, it wasn't raining that day." However, a person who is lying often reacts differently. Since they are focused on protecting their invented story, they may agree with your incorrect detail without thinking carefully about it. They worry that correcting you might lead to more questions and expose the lie. By quietly inserting a false detail and watching their response, you can often reveal whether the story is based on real memory or a fabricated explanation. In the end, spotting a lie is not about having supernatural abilities, it's about paying attention to patterns and small details. In this guide, we explored 7 powerful techniques that can help you recognize when someone might not be telling the truth. From asking smarter questions and observing the first 5 seconds of reaction, to establishing a behavioral baseline, checking consistency, noticing weak language, watching for sudden topic changes, and using interruption or fake details to test a story. Each method reveals different clues about human behavior. Of course, no single sign proves that someone is lying. People can act nervous or distracted for many reasons. That's why the most effective approach is to combine these techniques with your own intuition. When multiple signals appear together and something feels off, it may be worth paying closer attention. By practicing these skills, you can become more aware of deception and better understand the hidden signals in everyday conversations.